안녕하세요. 아이비셉트 영어 전임 강사 김다빈입니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘은 아이비셉트에서 진행하는 IB English의 Language Literature 특강 수업의 샘플 강의를 보여드리도록 하겠습니다. 본 강의는 실제 수업과 동일하게 영어로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. Okay, so today we're going through terms and techniques we can use for predominantly visual sources. And in particular, we're going to be looking at images and advertisements. So let's start off by defining what an advertisement is. An advertisement, to put simply, is marketing communication, which is used to promote a product, service, or idea. The IB Paper 1 examines static advertisements, which appear in the following mediums: newspapers, magazines, posters, and websites. For your IO, you are not restricted to static advertisements, which means you can also look at TV commercials and radio broadcasts. And the terms you're going to be covering here apply to both static advertisements and, well, other forms of advertisements as well, provided that they are visual. So let's move on. We're going to start off by looking at what signifiers are. So signifiers are the primary means for which an image, a visual source, conveys meaning. And signifiers can be classified into three main categories: symbols, icons, and logos. So as good IB students, what you're aiming to do, you want to understand and describe the connection between the signifier and what they signify. Okay, sounds a bit confusing, right? Let's look at some examples. To begin, a symbol is a visual representation of an abstract concept, at least in the context of visual sources. We have this, the heart, and we understand that the heart is a representation of love, which is an intangible abstract concept. Others, the visual symbols may include, for example, the dove as a symbol for peace, or, an eagle to represent courage. You get the idea now. An icon is slightly different. An icon is an image that has been made to resemble what it is representing. So it can have a degree of abstraction to it, but fundamentally, it is meant to look like something we know. For example, this could be an icon for a heart. At the same time, if you want it to be a bit closer to the actual, appearance of an anatomically correct heart, you might have this as an icon for, like the organ itself. Moving on, a logo. Now that is a symbol that has been purposely created to be associated with a certain organization or brand. For instance, if you look at this logo, we know that this is a representation, a symbol for the Comme des Garçons brand. And especially when it comes to logos, what you are aiming to do is to understand why that logo was created in such a way. In other words, what was the intended effect from that logo? Let's look at that Comme des Garçons logo just a bit more carefully. It's a heart with two eyes staring back out, towards us. What do you feel when you look at that logo? Playfulness? Maybe it is serious. Maybe it is bold. Who knows? But the truth is, whatever emotional reaction you had, there's a very high chance that the creators of that particular logo intended it and intended those feelings to be associated with the brand. So that playfulness, maybe that daring attitude, that would be something the Comme des Garçons brand wants to associate itself with. And that is how you can understand and describe the connection between a signifier and what they signify. We're now going to talk about composition and layout. Simply put, composition and layout, we're looking at terms to describe how visual elements within a larger visual source are arranged in respect to one another. So we have here a list of terms we're going to be looking at. I'll just give you a moment to look at that before I go into this section in more detail. Okay, so this might be pretty straightforward. These are just some examples of terms you can use to describe the physical relationship between two or more objects in a given scene. Let's look at these two images to begin with. This is a magnified version of the first one. So we understand that I want the viewer to focus on specific details. Maybe it's the scales of this lizard, maybe it's the details on its head, who knows. But the important part is the second image is a close-up, it's a magnified version of the original. So we can just say that it is a close-up or a zoomed in version. We can also see that the second image is on top of that first image. We can describe that in terms of overlapping images. And when two images overlap, you understand that the one on top has more visual importance. It is higher on the hierarchy of information. I want that second image to have more emphasis to the viewer than the first one. So that's how you understand overlapping images. You can also see that the second image has been rotated ever so slightly towards the right. And by rotating an element, taking it out of the rigid, 90-degree right angle layout, you're creating, again, emphasis. I am doing everything I can to get you to focus on that second magnified image. And lastly, if you were to describe these two images' position in relation to the whole screen, you can say, yes, they're close to the center, but slightly offset to the left. Now, let's look at these two images. So it's the opposite. The second image is a zoomed out version of the first one. And instead of overlapping, they're placed right next to each other. We can describe that as adjacent to each other. And of course, if you wanted to describe the position of these two images in relation to the whole screen, you can say they are towards the bottom right. Again, very straightforward but useful terminology just to make your paper one sound a bit more formal. So moving on from that, we can also look at tile and grid structures. Again, this is something you probably understand innately. To define it for you, a tile or grid structure is basically a regular pattern of equally sized denominations. And because it looks very neatly organized, what it creates is a sense of visual stability. It strengthens the organizational aspect of the text, makes it look more formal, more professional. It increases the ethos, the credibility of a visual source, maybe an infographic, say. And likewise, another organizational structure like many of these visual sources use is the row or column structure. So I know some students get confused between rows and columns. The difference is rows are horizontal while columns are vertical. And here we have an infographic with equally, sized columns, and that is often used to compare, very similar objects so that we understand their difference better. So if you have a comparison style infographic, there's a high chance that it is using a column structure for its information. We also have what is called the linear structure. So down below you have information that has been organized along a single axis. And this axis, right now, it's horizontally oriented, but it can easily be vertically oriented as well. So this style of layout is most often used for timeline infographics, when you want to show the progression of a certain topic or idea or subject over a period of time. Very suitable for that kind of purpose. So this, again, these are all terminologies you can use to describe different things happening, especially in infographics. And now going back to just more general visual terminology, we have the concept of negative space. So negative space is simply the space, the empty or blank space that is not taken up by visual elements. So if you're talking about this whole screen, all of that white space on the border, that can constitute as negative space. And if you're talking about this image, well, we have the Apple logo, so everything that surrounds the Apple logo is, again, negative space. So, by using negative space, you're telling the viewers where they should be focusing on. So it is making clear the dominant visual element within a given image. And here's the thing, negative space, if used cleverly, can also convey an additional layer of meaning. So let's look at the Apple logo carefully. We know that's the bitten off part of the apple, but you can also see there's a silhouette of a man with glasses. Now, if you're working with the associations you have with the Apple brand, there's a very high chance you'd have identified that silhouette, that man, as Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. So, and he's part of the negative space, but we can also see that he is part of the main image we want to focus on. So we know this is the Apple logo. What is the additional layer of meaning being created by that Steve Jobs silhouette? Well, it's very simple. It's suggesting that, if the apple wasn't bitten off, it wouldn't be the Apple logo, would it? And by having Steve Jobs' face, silhouette, incorporated into the Apple logo, is suggesting that he was instrumental to the creation of the Apple brand identity. That without Steve Jobs, Apple would not have been Apple, simply put. So that's how you can use negative space to create an additional layer of meaning, an additional interpretation of what you see, where applicable. We also have what is called the rule of thirds. So the thing about rule of thirds is we divide an image into 3 vertical and horizontal portions. And apparently this is a psychological effect. When people look at visual sources, they tend to look at images in this structure. And the point is not the divisions themselves, but rather the intersections of those dividing lines. Those are the regions of the image that viewers apparently focus most on. And if you reverse engineer that idea, advertisements would then want to position their most important information at or near those intersections in order to get viewers' attentions, as effectively as possible. So let's look at this Mont Blanc ad. Look at those intersections. You can see that here we have the smile of this model, and I don't know if you recognize him, but that is Nicolas Cage. He's a very famous actor from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And his trademark, his signature, so to say, is that very distinct smile of his. And of course, because people recognize Nicolas Cage by his smile, this advertisement has strategically positioned him so that his smile falls on that intersection. And in that intersection, you can see that there's a Mont Blanc logo. Again, we want to know what brand is being advertised, right? So it only makes sense to put that information close to an intersection. Here you have the wrist of the actor, the model, using the product. So that is creating ethos. Hey, a famous actor using our product, that is giving us, the recognition. Of course, they want to emphasize that. Hence why this wrist, the watch, being worn by the actor is also being shown near an intersection. And of course, here you have the tagline of this advertisement with let's use that language for the composition section again, a closed-up image of the watch, just to magnify the details, help viewers appreciate the details of the product more. So that, again, you will find near the other intersection. And if you now look at the whole advertisement, you'll see that the most important bits of information have all been purposely placed at or near the intersections created when we apply the rule of thirds to this visual source. So we're now going to talk about visual contrast. So visual contrast is created by a variety of elements. Lighting, color, you can also talk about form. Again, we're going to be looking at this in more detail, so I'll give you a moment to look at that and then we will move on. Okay, so to begin, let's discuss lighting. Lighting is simply how an object or scene is lit within an image or within a visual source. And there are many ways to describe lighting, but I think the simplest ways to do so are the following 6 words. You can talk about whether the lighting is warm or cool. So that has to do with the overall color scheme, like warm tones, red, oranges, yellows, cool tones, the greens, the violets, the blues. So we innately understand whether an image is warmly lit or lit very coolly. Dark and bright, again, very self-explanatory. An image can be relatively dark or it can be relatively bright. And this might be a bit more difficult to understand. You could talk about soft lighting, which means that the shadows aren't as harsh. Like you see the shadows, but they're not obscuring too much of the detail. So there's not too much contrast going on, whereas harsh lighting would be the opposite. It throws very sharp and clear shadows. So the things that are in the shadows are barely perceptible, and vice versa. The areas that are lit very brightly. So harsh lighting generally has more visual contrast, as compared to soft lighting, which gives off, that smoother, more rounded quality. So let's look at this portion of advertisement. I mean, we innately know that this is more warmly lit than it is, coolly lit. We understand that this is a brighter rather than a darker lit, like a darkly lit advertisement. And we also can tell that the lighting in this advertisement is softer, not harsher, because yes, we see the shadow being cast, but we can also see the details within the shadow. Like it's not obscuring anything. So that is how you can describe the lighting of the scene. Additionally, when it comes to lighting, you can also mention the direction from which light is being, shown from. In this advertisement, judging by the shadow, we can see that the light is coming from the side. Yeah, so that is your observation. You want to go a step further, however, because that is what creates interpretation. So to analyze the reason why light is being shown from that specific direction, you can look at the bits of the main object, the main subject of the ad, and what is being emphasized within it. So check it out. Because the light is being thrown that way, you can see that the so-called shoulders of the car, the curves, are being accentuated. And I think that is what the creators of the advertisement were intending in the first place. That's the parts of the car that they feel are most attractive and thus would best convince viewers to purchase the vehicle. And vice versa, if the light was shining from the back, so this back would be clearly lit, I think it would have created a very different atmosphere to the advertisement. Likewise, if the light was shining not from the side, but from the front, again, that would have cast the shadows this way. It would have obscured a lot of the details of the car. So you can see how the direction of the light can also be a strategic choice, especially in advertisements. So just understand, with the direction of the light, the brighter areas, the areas that receive more light, are the points of focus, the points in which the advertisement wants to draw our attention to. I can also talk about colors themselves. So just to remind yourselves of, your kindergarten or primary school, art classes, primary colors, blue, yellow, and red. These primary colors are visually powerful. That means they have strong emotional and cultural connotations. For example, when we say red, there are just so many different associations you can create with that color, right? Like red can symbolize danger. It can also symbolize passion, love. It also, is a color of blood, of violence. you name it. Red has so many connotations. The same goes for blue. You probably have heard people say, oh yeah, I have the blues. So blue, depression, but it could also symbolize, water, the sky, so freshness, cleanness. So there's, a lot of associations you can make with blue. Yellow, I would always say yellow is like a hungry color. It's most often associated with food and, food brands. Burger King, McDonald's, you name it. So these primary colors, understand that they have very strong associations, connotations attached to them. And each color has a complementary second color. By complementary, what we mean is that in the color wheel, they occupy opposite sides. So green and red become, complementary color pairs, orange and blue, purple and yellow. So what this means is that if you place these two colors close together, they create the strongest sense of visual contrast. Additionally, with colors, you can discuss whether they are saturated. That means they have a very strong, deep color versus desaturated. That's when the color is muted. So pastel tones, for instance, would be desaturated colors that have been, lightened as well. If it's desaturated and dark, it gives you that dull impression. Saturated, it's bright, it's eye-catching, might be even, painful to look at depending on what color it is. Like neons, for instance, are very saturated colors. There are certain advertisements that have, a lack of color variation. We refer to them with the term monochrome. So a monochrome color scheme means that, there is no variation in color. They're using simply one color and different hues and saturations of that color to create an image. So going back to the associations of blue with freshness, with newness, it makes sense that this cough drop ad would use a monochromatic blue color scheme in order to convey, like that effect of freshness to the audience. And last but not least, we need to understand the concept of accent colors. So accent colors are used sparingly, and they are often complementary colors to the main color being used in the visual source. For example, let's look at this screenshot from a website. We can see that the predominant color here is like a very dark but saturated blue. But the element that captures our attention the quickest is the red. And that, if you can read it, it says buy tickets. So this is the action this website is trying to get us to take. And it is no coincidence that it is, in a separate and almost complementary color. And if this red was used elsewhere in the ad, it would not have the same effect, it does right now when, it is just solitary. And that is the role of the accent color. It might not be used often, but because of that sparing nature and because of the contrast it creates with other colors, it is a very strong way to visually emphasize something. And advertisements, infographics, visual sources in general use that strategically for a range of purposes, which you, as a student, will now need to reflect on and interpret. We can also describe forms in terms of shapes and lines. This, I will keep it simple for the purpose of the English A language and literature course. When it comes to forms, there are two main categories. You can talk about curved, organic, and rounded forms. And these are often associated with flowing, soft, playful, and dynamic characteristics. Vice versa, you can have very straight, geometric, and angular forms, lines, and shapes, and these have the opposite effect. As these curved organic shapes, they have those hard, rigid, organized, and very static, like very still characteristic. As you can see how these two, you innately understand them to be very different from one another, and that also creates visual contrast in an advertisement. Now we're going to be looking at technical terminology. So this is, like the language you should be using in order to refer to specific parts of advertisements and infographics. So, the paper one is, formal writing after all, and it will definitely benefit you if you can use this accurate terminology as often and as, exactly as possible. So again, here's a list of terms. Have a moment to look at it, and then we'll move on. Okay. An image is simply a visual representation in 2 dimensions. There's also the word picture, and students might, be wondering, hey, what's the difference between an image and a picture? Well, there is no distinction. An image is a picture. You could use the two interchangeably, although the word picture also has the additional association of a physically printed image. So, but at least for the purposes of the IB English A Language and Literature course, you do not have to be too pedantic about the difference between image and picture. But what you do want to know the difference of is between photographs and illustrations. A photograph is a picture, an image that has been created by a camera or any other similar photoelectric device. That is a photograph. An illustration, vice versa, is a drawn or constructed image, as we see here. The point is to understand why a given visual source is using a photograph or an illustration. So what is the purpose? What is the intention behind using each one? For instance, if you were creating a more serious work, if your aim is to document life in the Sahara, for instance, instead of an illustration, you might choose to use the photograph instead because it comes across as more reliable, as it is, after all, a more accurate representation of reality. Vice versa, if you wanted to create an educational website about the Sahara for a younger audience, in that case, you might choose to use an illustration instead of a photograph, because the illustration, especially this illustration, with its soft pastel tones and its very simplified visual style, that might appeal to a younger audience. It comes across as less serious, less intimidating. So here, I've just given you an example of why a given text might use one over the other. We could also discuss fonts when it comes to visual sources. So the big distinction that we need to make with fonts is serif versus sans serif. A serif font has these little sticky out bits at the edges of the letters, and they are, I guess, the more classical fonts. And because of that, serif fonts have the following cultural connotations. They're classy, or if you want to put it more negatively, old-fashioned. But they also appear more formal, more serious. So if you're creating a text that wants to appear more formal, more professional, more serious, there's a very high chance that you would be looking at a serif font as your main font. Vice versa, a sans serif font. So they don't have the sticky out bits. As a result, they look much more visually cleaner. And because of that, they have the cultural associations of modernity, of being very clean. And with sans serif fonts, they can be used for formal occasions as well, but they more often than not give off either semi-formal or informal, feeling. So that is what you want to understand about the different types of fonts. With fonts, there's also the idea of a visual hierarchy. So if you look at what I have done underneath here, bigger fonts and capital letters have stronger hierarchy. They're higher up in the order in which we perceive them. So this is literally shouting out for your attention. And you can see how the smaller the font gets, your attention is diverted later than earlier. Connecting with the idea of rotated images, when a font is rotated, it also captures your attention. It is getting away from the right angle, like layouts that you're like familiar and comfortable with. So rotated fonts, understand immediately, hey, this is capturing my attention and is also trying to divert my attention to a certain part of that visual source. So this is what you can do to understand how font is being used in, like a visual context. And now we're going to be looking at the anatomy of the advertisement itself. So the biggest distinction you need to understand is that between the slogan and the tagline. The slogan is a short, snappy phrase which is, conveys the advertiser's philosophy. So usually brands will have slogans that they use across, almost every advertisement campaign. To give you an example, we have Nike, which is famous for its slogan, "Just do it." We also have, for example, McDonald's. I'm not sure if they use it, often nowadays as well, but they were very famous for their "I'm loving it," slogan. So BMW, in this advertisement, the slogan would be, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but it says underneath the BMW logo, "sheer driving pleasure." So this is the idea that the brand, the BMW brand itself, wants to be associated with. It wants, it's like its customers and potential customers to know or feel that their vehicles are, that much, are that pleasurable to drive. So that is the slogan. The tagline is specific to either the advertisement campaign or the product being advertised. So here, this is an advertisement of a BMW 5 Series. The tagline for this ad is "Release the power within." So whereas the brand itself wants to be associated with sheer driving pleasure, the vehicle is being associated with just power, hidden power. So it's suggesting, yes, this is a car that looks sophisticated, but it also is holding a lot of power, a lot of energy within. You can see why the tagline is specific to the product itself. We also have what is called the ad copy, or simply put, the copy. The copy of an ad is the main body of text. So this advertisement doesn't have all too much in the ad copy. This is just information about monthly lease payments, to entice, customers to lease the car. However, in other advertisements, you will see like paragraph, maybe multiple paragraphs even, discussing the product, the brand, the philosophy, you name it. And lastly, we have what is called the signature. So the signature of an advertisement before used to tell you the address of the company's headquarters, their contact information. Nowadays, the signature, it often usually consists of a URL, given the fact that most of our communication now occurs online. So there you have it. Oh, and before I forget, slogans too nowadays are often being replaced with hashtags as well. So there is a very high chance that in your upcoming paper once, you might have to discuss hashtags and social media trends as well. If anything, the IB English A Language and Literature course is very proactive about, addressing and adapting to new changes in mass communication. So lastly, we're going to be looking at different advertisement techniques. So these are just, the four main techniques advertisers use to convince their viewers to buy a certain product or subscribe to a service. And all advertisements will be using at least one of the four. And many advertisements will feature two or more of these advertisement techniques. So let's see how each of them work. To begin, we have what is called the testimonial. The testimonial is, well, if you look at this advertisement, it features a customer and her story. And that is pretty much what the testimonial is. It features, the real stories of actual customers to convince other potential customers, yes, this, product or brand being advertised is credible. It will, satisfy my needs. So the whole point of the testimonial technique is to create ethos in the advertisement. And, in order to do that, it is often paired with an anecdote. So here in the ad copy, that is basically an anecdote from this, mother on a mission. So to define an anecdote, that would be a short, personal story of an event or incident. They don't want it to be too long because then, the advertisement won't capture, like the audience's attention for that long. So short, snappy, to the point, gets the reader hooked. And testimonials often, feature celebrities as well. In that case, you could also refer to them as celebrity endorsements. But the general idea is the same. It is used to create ethos for the advertiser, for the brand, and the product. We have what is called the bandwagon effect. So this is derived from the phrase to jump on the bandwagon. It means to follow a trend, follow what everyone else is doing, to go with the flow, so to say. So the bandwagon effect in advertisement convinces the audience that they are missing out on the latest, most popular trend. So, in more modern parlance, you can talk about it as FOMO, like the fear of missing out. That's the effect, like the psychological effect, bandwagon effect techniques are, harnessing. So the bandwagon effect often pairs itself with a statistic to convince audiences that a certain product is being sold like hotcakes, being sold very quickly. And so, whereas the testimonial appeals to ethos, the bandwagon effect appeals to logos. And the thing about the bandwagon effect is it works best when it has a very specific target audience. For this, like mascara advertisement, they have focused their target audience as, to America. And that matters because an audience member seeing this might think, hey, if it's just being sold worldwide, cool, I guess. But they know that this is popular in the given region to which they belong to, they'll be that much more convinced to purchase the product. Hey, this is America's favorite mascara. Maybe I should get it too. I am American after all. I don't want to, fall behind the trend. And, it might even be narrowed down to a particular state, particular city, or a particular demographic. This is, the Generation Z's favorite mascara. So that might not appeal to, for example, the millennial customer base, but to other Generation Z customers, it would have, a that much stronger effect. So the bandwagon effect definitely benefits from narrowing its target audience down, specifying it. We also have what is called the problem and benefit technique. So the thing you need to understand about problem benefit is that it is not actually solving a problem. What the advertisement is trying to do is to confuse the audience's wants and needs by suggesting that what they want is actually a solution to a problem they did not even know existed. So check out this advertisement. Put more miles between you and your everyday. And is showing us a picture of a Mercedes van used for camping, for outdoors activities. So the problem being suggested by this tagline is your everyday, that means your routine, everyday life, is something that you want to get away from. Is that a problem necessarily? To some, yes, they might feel that it's a legitimate problem, but technically it's not a problem to most people, or so I would assume. And in order to solve that problem, in order to get away from your monotonous routine, what is it suggesting? You buy a Mercedes van. It's a pretty outlandish proposition, I would say, but that is pretty much what the advertisement is doing or attempting to convince you to buy its product. So, simply put, a problem benefit is about literally creating problems to sell products. And if you understand the problem and the benefit being, presented in the advertisement, you should now go ahead and think critically. Is the problem being suggested that convincing? Vice versa, is the solution, the benefit being presented to that problem enticing or logical? I mean, you can get away from your everyday, your routine with, like maybe booking a plane flight to a popular tourist destination, or even just, driving away somewhere for the weekend. You do not have to go full out and buy yourself a van for the purpose of getting away from your daily life. Again, so you have to think critically about the messages being conveyed in a problem and benefit scenario and determine how effective, how persuasive it is. Lastly, we have the concept of association. So this is linking the product and brand with images, with emotions associated with a completely different entity or concept. So this is a Marlboro ad, it's a cigarette ad, but it is associating the product and the brand with that of cowboys, the Wild West, that rugged individualism that often permeates American media. And the purpose of that is, that's what the brand is associating itself with, so that customers who see these advertisements, the next time they pick up a Marlboro cigarette, they'll be reminded of that, like that Wild West, that freedom, the sense of adventure and individualism that this particular image signifies. So that is how association works. So it relies on the audience's ability to understand and appreciate what is being shown. And the thing is, associations have a very highly cultural dimension to them. So I mentioned like that whole idea of cowboys and the American West. That would work far better with an American audience than I would assume for a British audience, say, let alone a Korean audience. So Marlboro, if they wanted to sell like the same product to a Korean audience, chances are they might use a slightly different technique, a slightly different subject to associate themselves with. And that is what you need to understand about the association technique. And with that, I will wrap up today's lesson. Thank you for watching.